So I have a confession. My confession is this: my forays into learning languages other than English have been unsuccessful. In high school, I attempted French. It wasn't pretty or romantic at all. Eventually, I learned two phrases that translate to "I don't know" and "I don't understand," because I figured out that if you responded to my teacher's questions in French, you'd pass. So everything she asked, "I don't know, I don't understand." But I said it in French. I don't even remember what those phrases were now. So I passed, barely, my 2 years of high school French. Then on a lark, in graduate school, I was a graduate student in architecture and engineering, and I had a summer on campus in which, oddly, I had nothing to do. I was on a fellowship and was enjoined from working. Okay. And none of the classes available to me in architecture or engineering did I require or need to advance my studies. So I thought, let's learn Japanese. Ambition, right? So there was an intensive course in Japanese, a kind of near immersion, that I thought, hey, this might just be the ticket, right, to get me over this language fluency problem I have. So I enrolled in an 8-week course that was equivalent to 2 semesters, in other words, 32 weeks of Japanese learning crammed into 8. I flunked in 4. I ended up knowing, again, only 2 phrases. How to ask for the time, "Ima nanji desu ka?" Okay, pretty good, huh? And to mention that the cat over there is dead, which is "Neko shindeiru." Now, why those two? I mean, the asking the time, that's pretty much 101 sort of kind of conversation. I don't know where I came up with the cat over there is dead. As an aside, for those of you here whom English was your second or third or fourth or etc. language, please know that you have my utmost respect and admiration. Because I hate to think what the 2 phrases I would know in English would be if it was my second language. Notwithstanding my profound linguistic deficits, I did learn something about language in all of these cases. Like how in Japanese, the vocabulary and sentence structure one uses is almost entirely dependent on the relationship to whom you are speaking and their relative social position to yourself. And at the time, I thought, God, that seems really weird and structured and kind of, what's that about? Until I realized that I do that all the time. It's a lot less formalized in English, but certainly, literally, the words I use with my best friends are not the words I'm going to use with you, or my wife, or my boss, or etc., right? Now, I remember in French that I struggled with the gendered articles, right, that would identify nouns in a gendered way, even things that, at least in English, are considered gender neutral, like a chair or a clock or a microscope, right? And this concept was really hard for me to get my head around, actually my ear around, as we say, because to me there was no reason or logic to the gender assignment for a plate or a vacuum cleaner. Now, of course, many of you who are fortunate to have succeeded in learning that second, third, or fourth language or whatever, however far along you are, you'll note that French is hardly the only language that genders its nouns. Further, there's not necessarily agreement between the languages that gender their nouns. There's no agreement on whether that chair is male or female, right? So in some languages, these objects, these plates, chairs, vacuum cleaners, whatever, might be female, might be male. And that led me to some interesting research studies on whether native speakers of, say, Spanish or German or Italian or French actually sort of think of objects as gendered because of the way their language is structured. And the answer to that question is, at least provisionally, yes. Take, for example, the English word bridge, okay? And I'm not talking about the card game, but the thing that allows us to cross a river without getting our feet wet or getting on a boat, right? Okay, bridge. So in German, the word is die Brücke, which is a feminine construction. Die being the feminine article for bridge. Whereas in Spanish, the term is el puente, and that's then a masculine construction. So for a Spanish speaker, the bridge is male. For a German speaker, it's female. And in studies, when asked to describe a bridge, German speakers will use the terms that they also associate with females, like fragile, or elegant, or beautiful. But Spanish speakers tend to describe bridges with terms that they associate with males: strong, sturdy, safe. Now, this English speaker, me, being pretty neutral on the gender of bridges, might describe a bridge as both elegant and strong, right? Or beautiful and sturdy. Especially, by the way, if you look at the bridges designed by Santiago Calatrava. Look them up. God, they're just gorgeous. And strong and beautiful and all those things. So now this whole notion of gendered associations in the context of our contemporary unlearning and relearning of gender is a topic I'm actually going to set aside for somebody else. I'm not going to go there. But what I am intrigued by is the way that the structure of our languages is formational in our worldview, the ways we experience our everyday living. So the structure of our languages ended up being formational in the way we see the world. So the research is suggesting that not only do German speakers and Spanish speakers name the bridges differently, they have significantly different experiences of bridges and different than mine. And those experiences are implicit in their language and unconsciously formational to their experience, okay? So all of that leads me to wonder, what is the implicit hidden biases in the one language I am able to speak, read, and write? And there's this 20th century Russian theorist, Mikhail Bakhtin, who wrote that language for the individual consciousness lies on the borderline between oneself and the other, right? The word in language, he writes, is half someone else's. And I love that idea. The word in language is half someone else's. In other words, when I speak or write a word, you will hear or read that word in context of your particular history and understanding. Language then becomes this kind of negotiation for meaning. And that negotiation of meaning gets embedded into our everyday lives. So what I've come to is this very imperfect and not really rigorously tested hypothesis. English is a moral language. English is a moral language. And what I mean is that while for the most part English doesn't gender its nouns, its words almost always have this moral judgment embedded within them. Even when we think a term would be morally neutral. And by moral here, I'm really going back to more of a sense of just good and bad, okay? Which is the simpler basis for the more common conception of moral being right or wrong. Underneath that right and wrong, there's this just good and bad dichotomy, right? But for my hypothesis today in my microphone, which keeps falling off my ear, I'm going to stick with good and bad. But I want to note, even that term moral, right, has an inherent moral judgment to it. Notice right now your internal response to the word moral. Do you have some ingrained sense that if something is moral, it is good? That something that is not moral, that is immoral, is bad? Okay, so you're with me on that. And sometimes we are explicit in our judgment of what we generally think of as morally neutral terms. For example, another confession of mine. My confessions aren't all that interesting, but they're kind of fun. I have this, I call it a small obsession. It may actually be a very large obsession with getting good seats to concerts or movies or sports events. Good seats. Now, you may not agree with me that good seats is a moral judgment. But note that in English, we use that same term good to refer to people who are compassionate, helpful, and loving, right? And we say a person who hurts or hates other people is bad, or at least their actions are bad. So I think that the moral judgment might be kind of this reflexive thought, whether or not it's explicit or implicit. So good seats is a moral judgment on the seats. All right, let's test this. Let's test this a moment. I'm going to say a word, and what I want you to do is pay attention to your automatic response to that word, okay? And see if you notice this sort of reflexive moral connotation for you. Ready? Actually, I'm going to say several. Mold. Mold. Got it? Did you notice your... Okay, good. Apple. Wasp. Warmth. Feces. Butterfly. Taboo. It's a fun word, taboo. All right? Comfort. Did you notice your responses? Maybe not to all of those words, but at least to some of them. I know I definitely do. When I think about the words themselves or what they signify, I lose that sense of moral judgment. So when I think about mold, right, my initial reaction is like, ugh, bad. Mold, bad. Moral judgment. But if I really think about it, I'm like, well, contextually, mold can be bad. And in some cases, it's actually really good. It just depends. But my reflexive reaction is that it's bad. It's negative. All right. So, are you ready for what I call the homiletic left turn? Because hold on, it's a pretty tight turn. I acquired a new habit during my sabbatical leave earlier this year. And I have yet to determine whether it's a good habit or bad habit. See what I mean? I can't just have a habit, right? I'm automatically going, okay, well, is it a good habit or a bad habit? Habit might be that morally neutral term, but sure as anything, we're going to make it moral. This is what English does for us, one way or another. Anyway, my new habit is to read the advice columns every morning as I eat my breakfast. And I don't think I ever, in my past, really ever read advice columns. But now I read them religiously. And I find them fascinating. So I read them in the Washington Post. And so there's a columnist named Carolyn Hacks, who I adore. because she's just so straightforward, straight shooting. You ask a stupid question, she's like, that's a stupid question. Right? And so I read Carolyn Hax all the way down to, what I call the gentle passive aggression of Miss Manners. That's a whole other thing. But honestly, I'm fascinated more by the writers of the letters than the advice that they get. Okay? In the vast majority of letters, I kind of read the letter and I think, if you have to ask, I think you know the answers, right? And you're either looking for confirmation of your opinion or permission to do the thing you really know you shouldn't. Or else the presenting issue is so richly complex that it's going to take, a few years of really good therapy to help resolve, and not just a few column inches in the Washington Post. Fortunately, most of the time, the columnists themselves know their boundaries well enough to point to either of those. In any case, I found it an interesting look into our human condition as I spooned oatmeal and sipped my coffee. Several months ago, Carolyn Hax was responding to a letter whose writer was fretting about her boyfriend's relationship with someone he works with. She called this workmate his work wife. Okay. And Carolyn was trying to help the writer reframe her reactions as a list of rules. I don't remember how many rules she laid out. I don't even remember the first two. If you've noticed, the title of this sermon is rule number 3. So there might have been more. There were at least 2 before. I don't remember what they were. Because the third rule was something else entirely, the kind of thing that quietly sneaks up behind you and smacks you in the back of the head while you're enjoying your breakfast, causing you to choke a little bit on that last sip of coffee, as I did. The kind of thing that is so obvious in its directive that you wonder why nobody's ever said it to you before. Or perhaps they did say it, but you say it and you weren't in a place where you could hear it. Shut up, Greg, just tell them what Rule 3 is. Rule number 3. Don't assign negative values to things that are merely different. Don't assign negative values to things that are merely different. Now, perhaps rule number 3 is eminently obvious to you, but it wasn't to me. Perhaps you've spent your entire life not assigning negative values to things that are merely different. If so, I am very envious, because ever since I read those 10 words, I have become hyper aware that I assign negative values to lots of things that are just merely different. The letter writer, the woman who was writing in about our boyfriend's work relationship, was comparing the workmate's extroversion to her own introversion and implying that the introversion was bad, or at least less valued than the other. She was applying negative values to something that was just merely different. Or my preference for good seats at the concert versus the bad seats at the concert. Where does that automatic valuation come from? They're just seats. There's no good or bad about them. They're different, right? In location and proximity to the stage, and usually price, right? But still, the seats aren't inherently either good or bad, and my implicit assignment of a moral value, good or bad, based on their difference, really doesn't make much sense. But friends, as I have observed myself and quite frankly others these last several months, and this works, man, if you're just talking to folks or if you're reading the news or listening to news, whatever, we do this. We English speakers do this all the time. I don't know. In other languages, it may happen all the time as well. I clearly don't know them, so I can't speak to that. But after learning rule number 3, I see that I and we tend to make these judgments so reflexively, and I think it has something to do with what I think is this morality embedded in our language, just like gender gets embedded in Spanish or German, right? Our language, I go back to this, our language is formational to how we experience the world. Now, friends, this is not to say that we should not make moral judgments, okay? Even such judgments that are maybe grounded in difference. So first of all, we do it anyway. We've already experienced that, right? We make the judgment anyway. And there are times when we probably should. A moldy apple is rightly considered a bad apple, at least in the context of our consumption of it, right? But we also note that a moldy apple in a compost heap would probably be a pretty good thing for the compost heap. Nonetheless, I believe that all of you can sort of intuit the problem with reflexively assigning negative values to things that are merely different, because it probably doesn't matter so much that we do this with concert seat selection or apples, but it really does matter when it comes to people. People. All those others, human beings out there in the world. How often do we see difference in people and reflexively assign negative values either to themselves, either to them or to ourselves? Sometimes we see people and the negative values get thrown on ourselves, that we're the bad person or we're the negative one. And how often do you let those negative values seep into moral judgment? So rule number 3, don't assign negative values to things that are merely different, has, for me, these last several months, become kind of a mantra. And it's been a powerful one, maybe one of the more powerful ones I've ever tried. It's this kind of spiritual practice that, get this, folks, awakens me to love. As I move through my days, every time I realize I'm assigning a negative value, a moral value to things or particularly people that are merely different than I or different than I have become accustomed to, I realize that isn't love. Assigning those values, making those moral judgments, there's no love in that. That kind of reflexive difference is bad, linguistic trick, doesn't get me to love. It doesn't open my heart, my life, my relationships. Instead, love shows up in difference as curiosity, as compassion, as wonder, as surprise, as delight. This is where, when we run into difference, love shows up when we get curious and compassionate, when we wonder, when we allow ourselves to be delighted and surprised by the difference. Love shows up too, friends, in sadness and in bewilderment. Love shows up in difference when I come to meet the difference, knowing that I am the difference too. And together, my difference and your difference join together to become part of the beloved community. So, friends, my invitation My invitation to you in your days and weeks ahead is to practice rule number 3. Practice it until it becomes the reflex, until it supplants that embedded automatic moral judgment that we have in our language and moves you toward an open-hearted, wonder-filled story of what it is to be alive. As the poet writes, our actions are essential to the one infinite story of what it is to be alive. We are the dust that hopes, a rising of dust, a thrill of dust, the dust that dances in the light with all the other dust, the dust that makes this world. Amen, my friends. And I love you. And may we live this blessing.